I used to think the difference between a man who rises and a man who falls was something big, something obvious you could point to. My name is Harold. I'm 85 years old, and it took me most of my life to understand that the real difference is so small, most people never see it until it's too late. When I was a young man, I believed in talent. I believed some people were just born with something the rest of us didn't have. I grew up in a modest home, nothing remarkable, nothing tragic either. My father worked with his hands, and my mother kept the house in a way that made everything feel steady, even when it wasn't. We didn't talk about success in big terms. We talked about getting through the week, paying the bills, doing what needed to be done. But I watched people. I always did. Even as a boy, I noticed how some men carried themselves differently. They spoke with certainty. They seemed to move forward while others stayed in place. I remember standing outside a hardware store when I was about 19, watching two men argue over something simple, a delivery that had gone wrong. One man got loud, defensive, full of excuses. The other one stayed calm, listened, and then said he'd fix it. Same problem, same moment, but something about how they responded felt like a dividing line I didn't yet understand. At that age, I thought the calm man was just more confident. I thought confidence was the difference, so I chased it. I tried to act confident, speak confidently, make decisions quickly. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it always felt like I was pretending to be someone else. In my 20s, I took a job that I wasn't ready for. Not really. It paid better than anything I'd had before, and I told myself that meant I deserved it. The truth is, I was in over my head. There were people around me who knew more, worked faster, thought clearer. Every day felt like I was trying to keep up with something that was moving just a little too fast. That's where I met a man named Walter. He wasn't flashy. You wouldn't have noticed him in a room unless you spent time there. But he had this way of handling things. Problems came to him, and they seemed to slow down instead of speed up. People trusted him, even when things were going wrong. One afternoon, I made a mistake, a big one. It cost the company money, and more than that, it cost time. I remember sitting at my desk staring at the numbers, feeling that tightness in my chest that comes when you know there's no way to hide what you've done. I thought about blaming someone else. I thought about softening the truth. I thought about saying as little as possible and hoping it would pass. Instead, I went to Walter. I told him everything, quickly at first, then slower as the words caught up with me. I expected anger, disappointment, maybe even a lecture, but he just listened. When I finished, he nodded once and said, "All right, now we fix it." That was it. No judgment, no praise, just that. We spent the next few hours working through the problem. It wasn't easy and it wasn't clean, but we found a way. When it was done, he leaned back in his chair and said something I didn't fully understand at the time. He said, "Most people lose right here." I asked him what he meant. He said, "They lose when things go wrong. Not because of the mistake, but because of what they do next." I carried that sentence with me, though I didn't know what to do with it yet. Life moved on the way it does. I worked, I married, I had children. There were good years and hard years. Times when things felt like they were coming together, and times when they felt like they were slipping apart. I had successes that made me proud, and failures that stayed with me longer than I wanted them to. In my 30s, I started to notice a pattern, not in other people at first, but in myself. Whenever something went wrong, my first instinct was to protect myself, to explain, to justify, to soften the edges of the truth. It wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it sounded reasonable, even responsible. But underneath it, there was always the same thing, a quiet attempt to avoid facing the full weight of the situation. And every time I did that, something small shifted. Not in the world around me, but inside me. It was like stepping just slightly off course. Not enough to notice in the moment, but enough that over time you ended up somewhere you didn't intend to be. I began to think about Walter's words again. Most people lose right here. I watched others more carefully after that. In meetings, in conversations, in moments when things didn't go as planned. Some people reacted quickly, defensively. They spoke more than they listened. They tried to reshape the situation so it didn't reflect poorly on them. Others did something quieter. They paused. They took in what had happened. They owned their part, even when it was uncomfortable. And then they moved forward. The difference wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was there, every single time. By the time I was in my 40s, I had a family to support and responsibilities that didn't leave much room for pretending. That's when the lessons started to settle in more deeply. Not as an idea, but as a choice I had to make over and over again. There was a year, I remember it clearly, when everything seemed to come at once. Work became unstable, money was tighter than we let on, and at home there were tensions I didn't know how to resolve. I felt pulled in too many directions, each one demanding something I wasn't sure I could give. One evening I came home later than usual. The house was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. My wife was sitting at the table, not angry, not upset, just tired. We talked, or at least we tried to. I found myself explaining things, defending decisions, pointing to circumstances outside my control. I was doing what I had always done. At some point, she looked at me and said very calmly, "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be honest." That sentence stopped me in a way I can still feel. Because the truth was, I hadn't been fully honest. Not with her, and not with myself. I had been managing the story, adjusting it so it felt more comfortable, more acceptable. But in doing that, I had created distance between me and her, and between me and reality. That night, for the first time in a long time, I stopped trying to explain. I told her what I was afraid of. I told her where I felt uncertain. I told her the parts I had been leaving out. It wasn't easy, and it didn't fix everything overnight, but it changed something. The air in the room felt different, lighter, even though nothing had actually been solved yet. That's when I began to understand what Walter had meant all those years ago. The difference between winners and losers isn't in the outcome of a single moment. It's in the response to it. It's in that small space between what happens and what you choose to do next. Most people, myself included for a long time, try to protect themselves in that space. They reach for comfort, for explanation, for anything that softens the impact. And in doing that, they step away from the one thing that could actually move them forward. The people who grow, the ones who eventually seem steady and capable, they do something else. They step toward the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. As I got older, this became clearer to me in ways I couldn't ignore. I saw it in my children as they grew up. I saw it in colleagues, in friends, even in strangers. Life has a way of presenting the same lesson over and over again, just in different forms. There was a time in my 50s when I was given an opportunity that I had worked toward for years. It was a leadership position, one that came with more responsibility than anything I had held before. I remember the day I was offered the role. I felt proud, of course, but underneath that, there was a quiet fear. The kind you don't talk about. In the early months, I made decisions I wasn't entirely sure about. Some worked, some didn't. When they didn't, I could feel that old instinct rising again, the urge to explain, to shift, to protect. But by then, I had learned something. Not perfectly, not consistently, but enough to recognize the moment when it arrived. So I started doing something different. When something went wrong, I would pause. Not outwardly, but inside. I would ask myself a simple question. What is actually true here? Not what sounds better. Not what makes me look better, just what is true. Sometimes the answer was uncomfortable. Sometimes it meant admitting I had made the wrong call. Sometimes it meant acknowledging that I didn't know something I should have known. But every time I answered that question honestly, something else happened. The path forward became clearer. Not easier, but clearer. And clarity, I found, is far more valuable than comfort. As the years went on, I stopped thinking of people as winners and losers in the way I once had. Life is too complex for those labels. But the difference I had been searching for when I was young, the thing I thought was talent or confidence or luck, I finally understood it. It's not something you're born with. It's not something you can fake for very long. It's a habit. A quiet, consistent habit of facing things as they are, not as you wish they were. That's it. And yet, it's the hardest thing for most people to do. Now, at 85, I spend more time looking back than looking forward. That's just the nature of things. And when I look back, the moments that stand out are not the big successes or the obvious failures. They are the small decisions, the ones that didn't seem important at the time. The moment I chose to tell the truth instead of shaping it. The moment I chose to listen instead of defend. The moment I chose to take responsibility instead of avoiding it. Each of those moments was a fork in the road. Most of them were so small I didn't even realize I was choosing a direction. But over time, they added up. I think about the people I've known, the ones who seemed to struggle no matter how hard they tried. Many of them were good people, capable people, but they had a habit of stepping away from the truth when it mattered most. Not because they were bad, but because it felt easier in the moment. And I think about the ones who found their footing, even when things were difficult. They weren't always the smartest or the most talented, but they had that habit. They faced things directly. They stayed with the discomfort long enough to understand it. That's the difference. It doesn't show up in a single day. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself slowly, over years, through choices that seem small at the time. If you're listening to me now, you might be waiting for something more. Some strategy, some technique, something you can apply and see immediate results. I understand that. I spent a long time looking for the same thing, but there isn't one. There's just this. When something goes wrong, and it will, pay attention to that moment right after. The one where your mind starts to move, to explain, to adjust, to protect. That's the moment that matters more than anything that came before it. If you can stay there, just for a second longer than you're comfortable with, and ask yourself what is actually true, you'll begin to see things differently. And if you can act from that place, even in a small way, you'll start to move in a direction that most people never do. It won't feel dramatic. It won't feel like a turning point. In fact, it might feel like nothing at all. But give it time, because that small difference, repeated over years, becomes everything. I'm 85 now, and I can tell you this with complete certainty. The distance between the life I lived and the life I might have lived was shaped in those quiet moments. Not by chance, not by talent, but by what I chose to do when things didn't go the way I wanted. So if you're wondering what separates those who find their way from those who don't, it isn't something out there in the world. It's right there in that small space after things go wrong. And what you do in that space will decide more than you realize.